Hey everyone, thanks in advance for watching this video. Today I'll be talking about how to handle null values using pandas. I'll be talking about the different ways we can remove null values from a pandas data frame, and then talk about the opposite of that, the different ways of filling null values in a pandas data frame. So dealing with null values is one of the first things you'll be doing when you're cleaning a data set. And then cleaning a data set is also 80% of the work that you'll be doing if you're a data scientist or really in the analytics field in general. So this is definitely a must-need skill and really the first thing you'll be doing when you're cleaning a data set. So you can follow along with me by downloading the Python notebook that I have linked in the description below. You can open Python notebooks in either Jupyter Notebooks or in Google Colabs. So as you can see, I have it open in Google Colab. So go ahead and download this. And really the best way to follow this video is to interact with me by just typing in the code as I type in the code. All right, so let's just get started. So we're going to be covering these four methods here. In terms of operating on null values, we're going to cover isNull, notNull, drop NAs, and fill NAs. So the first thing we're going to do is actually cover these first two functions. So detecting null values using isNull and notNull. So let's get started here by importing the libraries we need and then building a small pandas one-dimensional series so we can see how these methods work. So let's import NumPy as NP, and then let's import pandas as PD here. And then let's create a pandas data series called, or not called, but with these values. So it'll first have a value of 1, but then it'll also have a null value here, nan. So this is a NumPy attribute, and that's the reason why we imported NumPy here. So nan is actually another word or is an alias for null. So we want to add a null value, and one way to add a null value inside a pandas data frame is to use np.nan. We're going to add a string called hello, and then none. Right there, and the text when you type that in should also turn blue. This is actually another way of writing null or basically putting in a null value inside a pandas data frame. So, we just covered basically two ways, using the NumPy nan or just typing in none. And none again has to turn blue if you're working in a pandas, if you're working in Google Colabs. In Jupyter Notebooks, that might be slightly different. I'm not really sure. So let's just run this line of code. We get this 1 nan hello none, and let's actually just save it in a variable called data. Let's just then output it again. All right, and so now what we want to do, let's cover this first method here. isNull, generate a Boolean mass indicating missing values. So what a Boolean mass is it's going to basically be an array with true and falses. And it's going to be true if it's a null or it has a missing value. So I'll type true if missing value, false if value is present. All right, so in order to use isNull, we're going to just put that at the end of the data variable. So data.isNull. And the output should be a Boolean mass, which it is. So false because there's a 1, true because there's a null here, a nan, and then false because there's a hello here, a hello string, and then true because none also represents a null value. So data type bool is a Boolean mask or is a Boolean, and that's exactly what we expect. And you can use essentially this mask to then filter out some of your data, and we can do that right now. So one way to filter out the data is to then put data around it and use basically data.isNull as the Boolean mask. And so what should come out of that is the null values, right? So the second row here and the fourth row here, so indexes 1 and 3, are null values. That in itself is not super helpful because most of the time people want to detect the non-nulls, right? They want to filter out the nulls. So how do we do that? One way to do that is to use the not null method, which is this one right here, opposite of isNull. So let's just see how we can implement that. So we can do data.notNull just to see how this not null method works. It's basically the opposite of this, right? So true because the one in the first row is not null. And I won't go through the rest, but you understand what a not null value is. And so the more practical approach to filtering out or detecting nulls and not nulls is to actually use the not null as a Boolean mask. And then what you'll get is when you filter out the nulls is you get the non-nulls, which is the first row and the third row here, you get a 1 and you get a hello. And so this is typically what you want. You want data that are non-nulls. You typically want to clean out and remove null data in your Pandas data frame. So now that we've discussed how to detect null values and how to handle some null values, let's talk about another method and function of dropping null values and also another method of filling null values. So I'm going to be covering in this section the drop NA method to show you how we can use this method to drop single values of null or drop whole columns or whole rows of data if there is a null value within that column or with that row. So why would we want to do this? There could be cases where you're trying to develop an algorithm where you're using a feature, and the feature is essentially like, say, a column of data. Maybe it's age of a user, for example, and there are a lot of missing values there. You may not want to actually use that column, and you might want to just drop that entire column if you detect like the majority of your data has null values, for example, or if there's 1 or 2 null values, you might want to just drop that entire column. So this method and this function allows you to do that. And so let's illustrate some examples here to show you what we can do with the drop NA method. So really easy. I'm just gonna use the data frame from above. We have this, and so we can easily just drop the NAs by just using this function here. Oops. And we basically get just the non-null values, right? This is equivalent to this up here, but it's a lot easier to write. There's just less things to write, right? So I would just use this to the drop NA method to drop null values. So if you're following along with me, let's create this data frame here. It's a multi-dimensional pandas data frame with 2 nulls. And if you execute this code block, you will essentially get a 3x3 data frame with 2 nans or 2 nulls here. All right, so the first thing we want to do is let's just recreate this line here. So I'm going to write df.dropNA. Oops. And let's see what it gives us. It essentially is giving us the second row right here, because there is a null value on the first row and there is a null value in the third row. So by default, this method behaves by essentially just dropping rows where there's at least one null value present. So that's important to note, and we could actually play around with that parameter. We'll be able to, instead of dropping by, for example, rows by default, we can specify the function to drop by columns instead. And then we can also add, thresholds where, like the entire column or entire row has to have all null values before we drop it. So let's illustrate these two examples. So instead of dropping by row, let's actually drop by columns. So one way to do that is to play around with the access parameter. So if I do df.dropNA, we know that it's going to drop the row, right? But if we use this access parameter here and say columns, it's going to drop by columns. And this last column on my pandas data frame, this is the only column without any nulls. And so that's the only column that stays. So let's illustrate another parameter. I talked about dropping columns or rows where there are all null values. So that is going to be the how parameter. So I have some text here. If you have downloaded the Python notebook, the how parameter will allow you to drop rows or columns based off of whether that row or column has all null values. So let's create a column with all null values. I'm going to create it on my df data frame. I'm going to just tack on a column of null values here. So if I do that, now I get a column, this last column here with all null values. All right, so now let's play around with this dropNA method where maybe I'm going to drop by rows instead of columns. And then in terms of, well, actually let's stick with columns. Sorry, because we want to actually drop this column. And then I mentioned the how parameter, and the default on this dropNA. Oops, sorry, I'm having trouble writing code today. So df.dropNA. The default on this how parameter is any, meaning that if on the column axis, so the method's going to go through each column. If it finds any nulls in a single column, it's just going to drop that column. That's not what we want. We actually want to drop only columns where all of the values are null. So that's going to be the how equals all parameter. And so the value for this how parameter is going to be all. And so if I execute this line of code, it drops the null value, the column with all the nulls. All right, so for finer control, we can use this thresh parameter and specify the minimum number of non-null values we want to keep. So just important, these are non-null values that we are putting a threshold on. So let's just look at our df data frame again, and we have something like this. Just an important note, we dropped the last column here, right? But when I wrote df again and displayed the values within this Panda data frame, the column 3 is back. Why is that, right? Because we already dropped the third column here. Well, we didn't do it in memory, meaning that we dropped this, but we didn't save this new data frame anywhere. We didn't overwrite the older data frame, and we didn't save this data frame into a new variable. So nothing really happened other than it actually just happening here and just being displayed for one time. It didn't save anywhere else. Okay, so let's talk about this thresh parameter. I'm gonna use dropNA Let's actually drop by rows instead of columns this time. So we're going to do rows. And now this thresh parameter, as it says in this text right here, it lets you specify a minimum number of non-null values for the row to be kept, right? So what is that threshold that we want? Let's say that we want to keep this one right here, the second row. Let's just say we want at least 3 non-null values. That's kind of the difference between the first row and the last row compared to the second row anyways, that this first row has 2 null values and 2 non-null values. Second row, or the third row, has the same thing, but this middle row, there's only 1 null value. So in order for this threshold parameter to keep the second row, we're going to have a threshold of 3, right? Because there's 3 non-null values, and that's where we're going to set the threshold. So that's what we get. We get the second row, where the second row being displayed, it has 3 non-null values and 1 null value. And so this is essentially how you would use the thresh parameter to. So now let's talk about filling null values. So rather than dropping NA values or null values in a data frame, it's probably better to replace them with a valid value. So a valid value is defined really in any way you want it to be defined, depending on your use case. Sometimes you would want to fill in a null value with the average of the values in a particular column or row. Sometimes you just want to add in a random number, or sometimes you'd want to add in like the max value. It really just depends on your use case. All right, so to get started, let's create a Panda series object, and then let's talk about a few methods that we can use to fill in null values. So quickly, let's create a Panda series. And I'm going to essentially create the same one as we did earlier. With a minor difference of adding a few rows, as you see here, as well as changing the index. Instead of numbers, I want it to be B, C, D, E. I want it to be a text. All right, so if we save this into a variable called data and then output data, we will get a data frame with 5 rows. 2 of these rows have missing values, and the index is starting from A to E. All right, so the first thing we can do is fill in the NAs. So fill in the null values with a particular number or string or object. We're going to fill it in with the number 0. So one way to do that is to use the fill NA method. So I'm going to call my data object data, and then use the fill NA method, and I'm going to fill it in with the value that I want. So that's going to be 0. So the output of that should be where there were missing values, there is now a number 0. So that's super simple, right? So if I want to fill, I can manually just type in numbers to fill it out. There are more automatic ways of doing things. For example, what I can do is I can use certain parameters within the fill NA method called forward fill or backfill. So what I'm going to first do is a forward fill. So one way to do that is to call this parameter, the method parameter, and use a forward fill. So fffill or ffill for a forward fill. And if I execute this line of code, what I'll see now is, let me actually also print out the original data frame here. The forward fill basically will just propagate the previous value forward. So if the previous value is 1, and then there's a missing value here, right? It's just going to propagate 1 forward. And that's what I see here. And then it's the same thing for row D. Because there's a missing value here, I'm going to fill the number 2 forward into D, which is what I see here, right? So that's what we call a forward fill. A backwards fill is basically the opposite of that. Backfill. And so you can even just copy and paste this line of code to make it simple. And instead of f fill, just replace the first F with a B to specify a backfill. And then what you get is a backfill. It's essentially, if you look at this third row here, this 2 will then replace this missing value here. It's a backwards fill, and it's the same thing with this last row. It will fill the number 3 into this missing row, missing value row. So 3 will get put in row D. So that's exactly what you see here. It's just backwards propagating values. So that's for a one-dimensional Panda series. What happens, or how do we do the same thing but for a multi-dimensional pandas array? So basically something that you'll definitely be using. Not many people use like a one-dimensional pandas data frame. So with something like this, a multi-dimensional pandas data frame, we could still use the forward fill or the backfill method. We just have to specify what axis we want to do it in. All right, so let's try to use the forward fill parameter. I'm going to use the fillNA method, and I care about the forward fill method, which is going to be that. And then there's a second parameter called axis. And so we know that we can either use a column, we can place a column or a row. And so basically we're going to be filling on the column or filling on the row. You can type in rows or column. You can type in 0 or 1. And so you'll see this, basically handled in many different ways. So in this notebook, I used columns, or I used strings, right? I used either columns or rows. And so if we get that, if I write in columns, what I'll get is a forward fill based across columns, just like that. So in this original data frame here, the second row and the second column and the fourth column were missing. And so forward filling based off of columns would basically propagate this value into the missing value here and propagate the value 2 into the missing column here, right? And so this is basically axis equals column. And what you could also do is you can say axis equals 1. Instead of saying or typing out columns, 1 refers to columns and 0 refers to rows. So if I actually do an axis equals 1, I get the exact same thing. So you might see that when you're reviewing code or looking at code, you might see numbers instead of words being written out in this axis parameter. But just know that 1 equals columns and 0 equals rows. All right, so that's it for pandas handling nulls and filtering.